Good morning. My name is Shirley Adams, and I'm so glad that you've joined us for our online Sunday school lesson sponsored by Malden First Baptist Church. The title of today's lesson is Blessed, and it is based upon Genesis 30, verses 25 through 34 and 41 through 43. This morning, I reflected upon the blessings in my life, my relationship with Jesus, through whose death and resurrection I have forgiveness and eternal life. A supportive, loving husband, a hardworking, caring son, a wonderful extended family, this church and its caring members and opportunities to serve, provisions like food, water, clothing, shelter, enough money for comfort, good health. My list could go on. So much I've been given. And I humbly thank God because, as it says in James 1:17, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. But then I thought of something not in my life, despite many prayers to God about it. And maybe that has happened to you at times. And this morning, we are going to examine a frustrating time in Jacob's life when he may have experienced just that phenomenon. So let's catch up with what's been going on in Jacob's life. Jacob took advantage of his twin brother Esau's weakness by offering him a bowl of red stew in exchange for his birthright as the older son. That birthright meant double portion of the inheritance when their father died. And then Jacob betrayed Esau and deceived Isaac, his elderly and blind father. And as a result, Jacob received his father's blessing when Isaac had intended to bestow it upon Esau, his favorite son. And after that, Jacob undertook a sudden trip, billed as a journey to seek out a wife from his family in Haran. Haran was about 450 miles from his home in Beersheba, about a 2 to 3 week journey. This map shows the journey that he undertook. That area was where Jacob's mother Rebekah had been raised and her brother Laban and his family still resided. It was also the town from which his grandfather Abraham had first journeyed to Canaan, the promised land. But in truth, Jacob fled for his life because Esau, resenting what Jacob had done, became angry and threatened to kill Jacob once their father passed away. So last week we talked about how Jacob stopped to rest for the night in Bethel, which you can again see on this map. There he had a dream in which angels ascended and descended on a stairway that extended from earth to heaven. And in that dream, the Lord spoke to Jacob for the very first time. God affirmed that the covenant promises he first made to Abraham were then passed on to Isaac and now rested with Jacob himself. And also, the Lord assured Jacob of his presence and protection and that he could one day bring Jacob back to this promised land. Our lesson does not include the verses found in Genesis 29 through 30:14, but they're critical to understanding our passage. Having arrived at his destination, Jacob stopped at a well. It may have been the same well where Abraham's servant encountered Rebekah, who would become Isaac's wife. As a result, at the well, Jacob saw Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, and a shepherdess for the first time. Laban offered his nephew Jacob a place to stay, and Jacob fell in love with Rachel. Jacob agreed to work for 7 years in exchange for marrying Rachel. That did not happen when Abraham's servant procured Rebekah to be Isaac's wife. Why the difference here? Well, first, there was no mention of Jacob praying in this story as Abraham and his servant had done. Sometimes when we leave God out of that picture in making our decisions, we end up taking a longer, more difficult path. Laban probably felt that if Jacob married Rachel, he would be losing a shepherdess, and maybe he wanted to get something out of that deal. Besides, in the Jewish culture, the groom's father typically paid a bride price to acquire the marriage, the woman for marriage. So Laban would be expecting something in return for Rachel. Over the years, Laban may have learned of Isaac's wealth and God's blessing on that part of the family. Maybe he thought he could have done a better deal with the arrangement for Rebekah, and so this was his second chance. Maybe Laban had somehow gotten word that Jacob had done this terrible thing to his father, and ever the trickster himself, he was ensuring that he didn't become Jacob's next victim. But Laban certainly didn't treat his nephew the way I treat my nephews. I think he treated Jacob more like a servant, a slave, than a family member. But when 7 years had passed, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him Leah as a wife rather than Rachel, which is the woman he wanted to marry. How in the world could Jacob be deceived in such a way? Well, people have suggested several things. It was dark when Laban brought Jacob's bride to him, and she probably wore a heavy veil, as was a custom in those days, so Jacob could not see her very well. Perhaps she didn't speak much, so he didn't recognize the voice as being different. And Jacob may have been drunk because there was a marriage feast just before this consummation of the marriage, so maybe he just didn't recognize the difference. But in any case, there is certain an irony here, because Jacob had deceived his elderly blind father in a similar fashion. Now Jacob knew how it felt to be deceived and betrayed like this, and the story shows how much we reap what we do sow. Jacob sowed deceit, and he got that right back from Laban. We don't even know if Leah was complicit or if Rachel knew about this. It's even possible they thought that Leah was the one to be married. Who knows? But Jacob confronted Laban and protested, and Laban explained that it was a local custom that the older daughter get married first. And despite that disappointment and Laban's deceit, Jacob agreed to work for Laban for another 7 years so that he could marry Rachel right away. And Jacob's family grew. Jacob was probably around 40 years old when he arrived at Haran. This chart shows that Jacob had relations with 4 different women: Leah, Zilpah, Rachel, and Bilhah. And as a result, he had 12 sons and 1 daughter. The second chart lists each child in order of birth. It also speaks of the turbulent and complex circumstances within Jacob's family. He didn't have an easy home life for sure. Now Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. He loved Rachel much more than Leah, and the 2 women constantly competed with each other. We also find out that Rachel, like Rebekah and Sarah before her, was barren, while Leah bore 1 son after another: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel grieved that she couldn't have children, so she gave her handmaid Bilhah to Jacob, and Bilhah bore 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. When Leah saw that she was no longer having children, she gave her handmaid Zilpah to Jacob, and Zilpah bore 2 sons, Gad and Asher. And then Leah started bearing children again, 2 sons named Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter named Dinah. And it's so unusual that a daughter would be mentioned in one of these family trees, but she was mentioned in the lineage because there was later a tragic story in Genesis 34 that centered around her. But at last, Rachel was able to have a son, and she named that boy Joseph. And Rachel's second son, which was born later after Jacob's family returned to Canaan, was named Benjamin. And unfortunately, she died giving birth to Benjamin. All of this is important, though, because Jacob's 12 sons ultimately became the 12 tribes of Israel, which you will hear a lot about in the Rendon's polygamy, because that was certainly not the original plan in the Garden of Eden. But it does show how God works out his promises and his purposes through very imperfect people. And that gives me hope, because as an imperfect person, I need all the encouragement I can get. A lot is happening in this chapter 30, and it is a pivotal one in Jacob's life. The summary statement for today's lesson is God is faithful to bless his people. Let's see just how much God blessed Jacob. Our first point is point 1, past, Genesis 30, verses 25 through 30. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so that I can return to my homeland. Give me my wives and my children that I have worked for, and let me go. You know how hard I've worked for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor with you, stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." And then Laban said, "Name your wages and I will pay them." And so Jacob said to him, "You know how much I have served you and how that your herds have fared with me. For you had very little before I came, but now your wealth has increased, and the Lord has blessed you because of me. And now, when will I do something for my very own family?" So here in verse 25, we see that Jacob's children, except for Benjamin, were all born while he was in Haran with his uncle Laban. And when Rachel's son Joseph was born, somehow it seems that Jacob's focus changed. Suddenly he wanted to go back to Canaan. Perhaps he missed his family. Maybe he recalled God's promise about the land. But he had probably never intended to stay away from his home so long. Note that Jacob didn't say please here either. He just said, he commanded Laban to send him on his way. When we get to verse 26, Jacob didn't intend to go by himself. He ordered Laban to give him his wives and children and then to let him go. By Jacob's reckoning, he had worked hard for this family and fulfilled all his obligations to Laban. From these verses, how would you describe the relationship between Jacob and Laban? Well, the relationship feels strained and tense, and obviously Jacob had had enough. Laban had deceived Jacob and taken advantage of him time and again. Jacob no longer trusted Laban, his uncle. So in verse 27, we see that Laban may have been taken off guard by Jacob's sudden demand to leave. He responded in a somewhat conciliatory manner, given Jacob's directness of speech. As desperately as Jacob wanted to leave, though, Laban wanted him to stay. In verse 27, we see that Laban mentions something called divination. What do you think that is, and why would it displease God? And does it have any relevance for us today? Well, the Hebrew word used here can mean to learn something from experience, and that's the way the King James Version of the Bible renders it. But usually this word is used in the Old Testament to imply that somebody is resorting to supernatural means. And the context here implies that Laban had resorted to incantations, magic spells, omens, or some other mystical means to obtain hidden information or to predict the future. So some examples of divination in Laban's day are very strange. They might have included consulting idols, examining the liver of a sacrificed animal, noting its color, placement, size, and what spots might be on it, pulling arrows out of a quiver and observing the pattern as they fall, looking in a cup filled with liquid, or looking at the way oil swirled in water, or inspecting human corpses. I mean, none of this pleased God either. Laban appeared to have no qualms about using these methods, and surrounding people like Egyptians, Philistines, and Babylonians regularly resorted to such practices. But God detested this, and he prohibited it throughout the Old Testament. And why was it so wrong? Well, divination allowed a person to bypass the Lord and do his own thing, and it opened the door to demonic influences. And so God never liked people to do this. He wanted them to rely upon him alone. The irony is that Laban tied the Lord, using his covenant name, into the statement when God found divination so offensive. In contemporary terms, divination is still out there. We don't call it that. Fortune telling through cards or crystal balls, the use of Ouija boards, people reading palms, psychic readings, fortune tellings by astrological sign, you name it. It's even possible to misuse the scripture, to take out parts of it, to construe it, to twist it to fit your own agenda, reinterpret it, making it say what you want it to say. So this verse holds a warning for us today, and we must be careful not to turn to other things rather than rely on God. Our insight and guidance need to come from him. Laban got one thing right here, though. He said that God had blessed him because of Jacob's presence. And Laban attempted to use Jacob's faith and a bit of flattery to convince him to stay. Note that Laban used the covenant name for God, and that's very important. He used Lord in all caps. And he was just trying to get to Jacob and get him to stay. That's all he wanted. In verse 28, Laban glossed right over Jacob's request to leave with his family, and he focused on the idea of wages. What was it? What would he have to pay to get Jacob to stay? His words urged Jacob to name his wages, and they sound eerily like the words he first used when Jacob had arrived. And Jacob wasn't going to fall for it. He didn't want to become obligated to this man again, so he didn't want to be tricked. It's a sad commentary on Laban's life, too, that he is so concerned about financial blessings that he wanted to keep coming because Jacob lived with him. He realized God was blessing him for that reason. He made no mention of his daughters or his grandchildren in this passage anywhere here. He just wanted the money, the wealth. So in verse 29, Jacob responded by using the words, you know. And my husband Tom says, I say you know a whole lot. Well, these words emphasize the truthfulness of what he was about to say, for Laban had experienced it and seen it with his own eyes, and Laban couldn't deny it. And it's the second time Jacob used this phrase, the first time being in verse 6. Jacob emphasized how hard he had worked for Laban. Laban's herds had increased under Jacob's tender care, and the animals had flourished so much. And since money was really not in regular use at that time, the number of herds and animals a man possessed was that one measure of success and wealth. When we get to verse 30, Jacob noted that Laban had little before Jacob's arrival. And now, though Jacob remained rather poor, Laban had become quite wealthy by God's blessing, and Jacob gave God the credit for making Laban a wealthy man, saying that God had blessed Laban just because Jacob lived there. Now, Jacob wanted to concentrate on his own large family, and he wanted to address their needs. No one likes to feel cheated or taken advantage of, and Jacob had been burned in the past by Laban, so we're going to see how careful he was to work out the details of this deal he made with this man. Point 2 is called present, and it's Genesis 30, verses 31 through 34. Laban asked, "What should I give you?" And Jacob said, "You don't need to give me anything. If you do this one thing for me, I will continue to shepherd and keep your flock. Let me go through all your sheep today and remove every sheep that is speckled or spotted, every dark-colored sheep among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the female goats, and such will be my wages. In the future, when you come to check on my wages, my honesty will testify for me. If I have any female goats that are not speckled or spotted, or any lambs that are black, they will be considered stolen." "Good," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." So in verse 31, what did Jacob mean when he responded to Laban's open-ended offer by declaring that Laban didn't need to give him anything? Well, he wasn't looking for a handout. Over the last 14 years, Jacob had worked hard for Laban, and Laban's herds had grown and thrived under his diligent care. In short, Laban owed Jacob a wage. And Jacob remembered God's promise and his vow at Bethel that God would watch over him, that he would provide him with food and clothing and bring him back to the promised land. Jacob was expressing his absolute trust that God would do what he had said. But Jacob no longer trusted Laban, and Laban did not trust Jacob. Jacob probably tantalized Laban and threw him a little off balance by suggesting this bartering arrangement. "You do this one thing for me, and I will continue to be your shepherd." But what was that one thing? Well, verse 32 says, all Jacob wanted was his own herd, so he could amass some wealth for his own family. And he suggested a method of accomplishing that. He would claim all the speckled, spotted, and dark sheep, and all the speckled and spotted goats in Laban's herds. And typically, shepherds in the Near East were paid by giving them a percentage of the herds they tended, and a percentage of the byproducts like wool and milk. But this was not what Jacob asked for. Laban thought he was getting the best deal ever. Sheep from that region were called Awasi fat-tailed sheep, and they were usually whitish. This picture kind of shows what they look like today. And you can guess why they were so named, the fat-tailed part at least. Most of the goats from that region were usually black. And Jacob asked for the rarest animals here. So it would seem that Laban would lose very few animals to his nephew in this process. As we look at the next two verses, 33 through 34, we see that built into that method, Jacob suggested there was accountability. I'm sure Laban liked that. That probably reassured him. Spotted, speckled, and dark animals would genetically give rise to spotted, speckled, and dark animals, and Laban could drop by any time to check Jacob's herds to see that no trickery had taken place. Note that Jacob says that when Laban comes to check and not if he comes. These two guys really didn't trust each other at all. And in the end, Laban saw the deal as a win-win situation for him, and he agreed to Jacob's plan. We're getting deeper into Jacob's story, and how would you say his actions demonstrate a growing faith and dependence on God? Well, for years, Jacob had relied on his wits, deceiving and tricking others to get exactly what he wanted. Some sources place Jacob's age at 40 when he first arrived in Haran. That would make him now in his mid to late 50s at this point in the story. But other sources claim he was actually much older at this time. During these years of working hard for Laban, Jacob saw and experienced so much. He met his match in Laban, and he matured both as a man and as a believer in Yahweh. I see several indicators of his growing faith here. In verse 33, back in the previous passage, Jacob mentioned his integrity and honesty could be checked. The old Jacob would never have mentioned that or even cared about it. Then much earlier in verse 30, Jacob attributed the blessings on Laban as being the work of God himself, God's blessing. And Jacob's desire to return to Canaan, well, that showed that he remembered God's promises to him at Bethel. And it would take courage to go back back to Canaan, there was Esau to worry about, and Esau was not in a good mood when he left, so there was a lot of risk involved, and he would have to trust that God would be with him and protect him in this process. And we also see in verse 30 that Jacob seemed more concerned about his family than himself. Now that truly was a change in a man that had previously been so fixed on his own needs and self-centered. And later, in Genesis 31, 10 through 13, Jacob talked about this dream from God about taking flocks that were speckled, spotted, and dark-colored. And if this dream actually really preceded the deal he made with Laban, that means that Jacob actually trusted God enough to follow his directions, even when, as a shepherd, they didn't make much sense to him. So Jacob tried to be transparent and honest here. But Laban was up to his old tricks. And if you look at the intervening verses, we see that Laban was, on that very day that he made the deal, he separated out the multicolored animals in question and he moved them 3 days away from Jacob. That would have been a distance of about 40 to 50 miles away. And he placed these sheep and goats, which should have gone to Jacob's herd, under his son's care. Laban hoped that there would be a few of the animals in question left, and that Jacob would never get a successful herd, and he would never get wealthy, and then he would never leave. So meanwhile, Jacob continued to faithfully shepherd Laban's main herds. I guess that Laban did not know about the one clause in the original covenant that God gave to Abraham. Those who blessed Abraham and his descendants would themselves be blessed, but those who treated them badly would find themselves in a pickle. And so he was about to find himself in a pickle. Point 3, future, Genesis 30, 41 through 43. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob placed the branches in the troughs in full view of the flocks, and they would breed in front of the branches. And as for the weaklings of the flock, he did not put out the branches. So it turned out that the weak sheep belonged to Laban and the stronger ones to Jacob. And the man became very rich. He had many flocks, female and male slaves, camels, and donkeys. Well, I don't want to get bogged down in all these shepherding practices from the Old Testament times, because some of this stuff just isn't going to make sense to a 21st century American. Maybe Jacob was following instructions from God here, because he did mention that dream in chapter 31. But maybe his actions simply reflected some ancient folk customs. But these verses describe various things which Jacob did to augment his herds, and he worked at this process for 6 whole years, which demonstrates a great deal of patience on his part. First, Jacob separated the strong animals from the weak ones, using only the strong ones for his breeding purposes. And then he set peeled branches in the water troughs before the animals he wanted to breed. These branches came from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and when he peeled back the bark, it produced white stripes underneath. Some have suggested that maybe a chemical released from those branches stimulated breeding or somehow changed the appearance of the animals. Who knows? One thing we do know is that in the original Hebrew language, this text includes a play in words that implies that Laban would get the weaker animals. Also, the Hebrew word for almond is Luz, and this is a previous name for Bethel, where God first spoke to Jacob and gave him the promises. Finally, Jacob made the flocks face the street and completely dark sheep. And I don't know what that was supposed to do, but he must have thought that this would help in the process. Now, did any of these practices change the white sheep to speckled, spotted, and dark animals, or the dark goats to speckled and spotted goats? Well, I don't think so. I sincerely doubt it. It was God all along blessing Jacob that made the difference, because genetically what happened was simply impossible. But with God, all things are possible. Somehow these typical sheep and goats switched into the varieties that Jacob was able to keep and build his flock from, and only God could have done that. Verse 43 says an awful lot about this. How was God keeping his promises that he made to Jacob at Bethel? Well, let's look at that. First, God had protected Jacob from Esau. Esau could have pursued him, but he didn't, and Jacob remained safe. And then God gave him this large family, the promised descendants who would one day lead to the great nation of Israel. And all the while, Jacob suffered from Laban's deceit. Jacob grew in maturity as a follower of Yahweh. He learned that was not the right way to treat people, this deceit. He grew to trust God more and more with each passing day. And that too was a blessing, which Jacob himself may not have instantly recognized, but it was. He was growing in faith. And God protected Jacob from Laban's trickery and hiding the animals which should have gone to Jacob, and in the process blessed Jacob beyond anything imaginable. God did what only God could do. He bent the natural laws of genetics and performed a miracle right there before Jacob's eyes. He hadn't seen any progress on the promised land yet. But in his heart, Jacob knew that this was going to be fulfilled too, because he told Laban that he was ready to go back home, back to Canaan. And God's promises are a major theme throughout Genesis and in the Old Testament, as is his faithfulness in fulfilling what he had promised. In subsequent verses, we see Laban's sons weren't so happy with this turn of events. You could imagine it meant they had much less inheritance. And Laban's attitude towards Jacob began to change. Laban was no longer accruing wealth. In fact, his herds were dwindling and they were weaker, while Jacob grew exceedingly rich. Then God instructed Jacob to return to his homeland with his family. God's blessing and his faithfulness to his people are major themes repeated throughout Genesis. Why would these have been important in biblical times? Well, all these patriarchs have been dead for centuries, from 500 to 1,000 years when Moses wrote this narrative. Moses was busy journeying through the desert, leading the Israelites, the original audience, to the promised land. And these messages, and particularly Jacob's stories, well, this must have resonated with the wandering Israelites, since they were simply living on a promise. They were counting on God's promise, because when they got to the promised land, they were really believing that God would take care of them. The writer of Hebrews says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And they need to be reminded, as do we, that God is ever faithful to what he has promised to do. He was faithful to Jacob and all the patriarchs, and he is faithful to you and me, even when our times are troubling or difficult circumstances arise. So there's some things that I'd like you to think about with this lesson. First of all, the idea of blessing is a thread that runs throughout Genesis. This week, take some time to thank God for the blessings in your life and God's faithfulness to you, because it's so easy to say, I did this, I worked hard for that. But don't forget how dependent we are on God, and that every good and perfect gift does indeed come from him. Bless others with your words. There's a lot of criticizing, complaining, and grumbling going on in our culture right now, and we can choose not to be a part of all that, especially on social media platforms and in our relationships with other people. Who might you need to encourage this week with your words? And I saw this phrase, which may seem trite, but it is a good one. In a world where you can be anything, choose to be kind. And sometimes that's not easy, and there are surely a number of people in our lives who could use the blessing of our kind and encouraging words. And we can bless others through our actions. Jacob worked hard to care for Laban's flocks, and he put in time and effort, and God blessed him for that. Laban became quite wealthy, and Jesus challenges us to be salt and light in our world today. He has blessed us not so we can keep it all to ourselves, but so that we can bless and help others through our lives. And that can mean sharing your time, your resources, spiritual gifts, you name it. But there are people everywhere who need what only you have to give. So this week, consider what call God has placed on your life, and maybe take some actions in that direction. And just because someone treats us badly, that doesn't give us permission to do the same thing right back to them. Laban deceived Jacob, but Jacob did not seek revenge here. Instead, he continued to trust God, and he continued to work. The scripture should inform our actions, and it says to forgive and not to seek revenge. As Christians, we also need to be people of integrity, people who make every effort to keep our promises. The way we live our lives before others can either compromise our testimony about the Lord or can build it up and strengthen it and make it winsome to other people. And the choice is clearly ours. In this story, we see that as Jacob grew in his faith, he also grew out of his dishonest and sinful ways. And finally, I would urge us all to be patient. The dream delayed is not necessarily the dream denied. Consider Jacob, who stayed in Haran for 20 years, but God ultimately blessed him with an extensive family that became Israel, and large herds that made him wealthy, and then returned him to his homeland, where Esau accepted him. And even when Jacob was stuck in Haran for the 20 years, and Laban kept deceiving and taking advantage of him, God was blessing him all the while by maturing his faith. God has a purpose and a plan for each of our lives, but sometimes He must prepare us first to receive, and He must grow us up, mature us in our faith. The timing is of His choosing, and sometimes the thing we most want is not what we most need to have. Trust God, who is sovereign and knows what will bring us the most joy and growth in our spiritual lives, and accomplish His purposes at the same time. So with that, we'll close. I want to thank you for joining us this morning. And if you have a need, a concern, or want to discuss your relationship with Jesus, please give us a call at 864-288-7835 or contact us on the website at maldenfirstbaptist.org. And I pray that you have a wonderful week in the Lord.